In 1274, the fate of Japan hung by a thread. A storm was brewing, not in the skies, but across the sea. And on the tiny island of Tsushima, a mere 200 samurai stood in the path of annihilation. What followed was one of the most jaw-dropping last stands in military history, an impossible victory forged through steel, blood, and unshakable honor. These were not just any warriors. They were the defenders of the first line, the shield between the Mongol Empire and the Japanese mainland. And they knew they wouldn't survive. But surrender? That wasn't in their vocabulary. Leading them was a man who would become a legend. So Sukekuni, the island's jito, or military governor, he understood what was coming. His scouts had reported strange foreign ships along the horizon. Massive vessels, black-hulled, square-sailed, unlike anything the Japanese had seen before. Rumors spread like wildfire. 50,000 Mongol invaders, backed by Chinese engineers and Korean warriors, were preparing to crush Japan underfoot. To understand how we got here, we need to look across the sea, into the heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis, now ruled the Mongol Empire. But even that wasn't enough. After conquering China and Korea, he set his sights on Japan, an isolated, proud nation that had refused to pay tribute. When the Japanese shogunate ignored Kublai's envoys, he took it as a grave insult. There would be no more letters, only war. His invasion plan was monumental. Over 900 warships were constructed, some large enough to carry entire cavalry divisions. Chinese engineers brought advanced siege engines. Korean craftsmen supplied the fleet. Mongol generals drilled their troops with brutal precision. This wasn't just a military force, it was a tidal wave. And at its first point of impact stood Tsushima. The samurai knew the numbers, they knew the odds, but bound by the code of Bushido, they didn't flinch. If they were going to die, they would die with swords drawn. Sukekuni organized every capable warrior on the island. Even aging samurai passed their prime donned armor. Farmers and villagers assisted, reinforcing choke points with logs, rocks, and traps. The mountainous terrain of Tsushima became their fortress. And the armor they wore? It was a marvel. While Mongol armor was layered and rigid, the Japanese samurai armor combined flexibility and protection, perfect for guerrilla warfare in dense terrain. Armed with katanas, naginata, and yumi bows, they turned the forests and hills into a deadly maze. Sukekuni refused to fight on the beaches. He knew a direct confrontation would be suicide. Instead, he placed his men along narrow mountain passes and dense forests, areas where Mongol cavalry would be useless. Hidden towers were built to pass smoke signals from one hill to the next, tracking enemy movement in real time. The samurai didn't have numbers, but they had the land, and they were going to use every inch of it. Before the battle, each warrior performed a solemn ritual, composing a death poem. These weren't simple farewell notes, they were declarations of purpose. Lines etched in brush and ink, accepting death while embracing honor. It was a spiritual armor, binding their souls to the cause. Then came the signal they were waiting for. A fisherman, pale and breathless, arrived in the night. He had seen it, an endless line of sails stretching to the horizon. The Mongol armada had left Korea. Signal fires erupted across the island. Every outpost, every lookout, lit with the blaze of coming war. It was October 5th. The final countdown had begun. Sukekuni's strategy was clear. Avoid the beaches, lure the Mongols inland, and strike from the shadows. Traps were laid. Arrows were fletched. Armor was strapped tight. And across the hills of Tsushima, a quiet, tense stillness fell, broken only by the crackling of torches and the distant sound of waves. Then, on October 9th, under a sky thick with storm clouds, the Mongol fleet arrived. Ships so large they blocked out the sun. Drums thundered. War cries echoed across the waters. And then, silence. The first wave landed. Mongol soldiers disembarked in tight formations, confident, armored, disciplined. They expected resistance, but not what came next. From the trees came a hail of arrows, deadly and precise. Samurai warriors leapt from the underbrush, striking with surgical speed before vanishing into the mist. Mongol ranks broke formation, unable to respond to the terrain. The island itself had turned against them. Sukekuni led a detachment of 40 samurai into the most daring ambush yet, targeting the personal guard of a Mongol prince. The clash was brutal. Arrows flew, steel clashed, and by the end, the elite guard was annihilated. The prince fled in panic, leaving behind the corpses of his finest men. Elsewhere, Mongol cavalry units tried to press inland, but were shredded by sharpened stakes buried along narrow trails. Horses screamed, riders fell. The invaders were fighting a ghost, an enemy that never stood still, never offered a fair fight. Then, as night fell and rain began to pour, the samurai struck again. They slipped down mountain paths, boarded Mongol ships under the cover of darkness, and set them ablaze. Flaming arrows lit the stormy skies. Enemy sailors jumped into the churning sea. Panic rippled through the fleet. Nature itself seemed to rise in revolt. That night, a violent typhoon slammed into the Mongol navy, ripping ships from anchor, smashing them against the rocky coast. Bodies washed ashore by the hundreds. Fire and water combined to create a massacre. By dawn, the impossible had happened. The invasion had collapsed. Half the fleet lay in ruins. Thousands of invaders were dead or scattered. And somehow, Tsushima still stood. Of the 200 samurai, almost all had perished. But their sacrifice had lit a fire. News of their stand spread across Japan, inspiring a nation to prepare for a second invasion. Fortifications were built. Military tactics evolved. Samurai culture was reborn with a new sense of purpose. Kublai Khan, humiliated and furious, would try again 7 years later, but even with a larger army, he would fail once more, thanks again in part to another divine typhoon, the kamikaze. But it all began here, with 200 warriors who faced death with no hope of survival, who stood not to win, but to defy. And in doing so, they became legends. Their story is not just about war, it's about what people are capable of when they stand for something greater than themselves. The 200 samurai of Tsushima didn't just fight the Mongols. They fought the impossible, and they won.